All right, I'll have some time before we get started so we can have people funnel in. I already see people starting to join. We'll just wait a few more minutes and then we'll jump into it. Hello, everyone that's joining in. We're just going to take a couple more minutes before we get started today and just do a quick introduction and then jump into things. All right, I'm just going to start off with a quick introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Data Preparation Best Practices, How to Optimize Your Data Analytics Process. I'm your host, Katie Zwiefel, and I'm with Tessellation and Data Coach. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started in today's presentation. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A module. This way, we're able to make sure we do not miss any questions that may be lost in the shuffle in the chat box. James will be happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. Also, be free that function to introduce yourself. We would love to know your name, where you work, and what position you hold. This is also a great way to network. Feel free to drop your LinkedIn profile in the chat as well, and please be mindful and respectful to one another and have fun during the webinar. All right, before we get started, we have a quick message from our sponsors, Tessellation and Data Coach. Tessellation is a modern analytics consultancy. We enable and manage organizations' analytics and self-service teams by educating people, optimizing technology, developing world-class products, and providing sustainable results. And Data Coach, where most analytics training programs lack depth, Data Coach provides wisdom. Our modern curriculum is unparalleled, comprising of video lessons, hands-on exercises, and a capstone project designed around your company's data. Data Coach also offers a truly premium service, one-on-one coaching. I would also love to introduce today's speaker, James Zerbies. James has over a decade of experience in analytics and BI development, which he leverages to build efficient and elegant solutions for his clients. From executive dashboards to operational and real-time reporting, he can leverage complex data sets to solve problems and provide insights that are effective and scalable. James specializes in healthcare and insurance data, as well as workforce optimization, and has experience in both private and public sector analytics work. He designed a suite of real-time dashboards for operational command centers, analytics tools that allowed a single forecasting team to do the work of several, and systems for efficiently scaling operational reports across hundreds of metrics and KPIs. From data source to dashboard, James works to bring clarity to the story that the data is telling, oriented towards design that is relevant and actionable. All right, without further ado, James, please take it away.
All right, thanks, Katie. Appreciate the introduction. Hope everyone's doing well today. I'm just a little more about me. I live in Minnesota, about 30 minutes north of Minneapolis, which is where Tessellation is headquartered. Headquarters. Not sure if I can make that into a verb, but yeah. So it's a little chilly this morning. I brought my son out to the bus stop, and it was definitely below freezing for the first time, I think, this season. So hope everyone is doing well. Keeping warm depending on where you are in the country, and yeah, and I recognize a few names in the attendees, so I'm glad to see everyone. Hopefully I can make it worth your time. If you're eating lunch around this time, then yeah, hopefully I can enhance your lunchtime experience. But anyway, yeah, yeah, I'll jump right in. I'm going to talk about analytics in terms of data prep. Specifically around optimization. Why it's important, why it often gets kind of brushed under the rug a bit and deprioritized until it becomes a big problem and you can't ignore it anymore. just some of the things around that. There are a variety of tools that are available in various BI stacks and platforms. Surrounding data tab, we've got or data prep, we've got Tableau prep, we've got Alteryx are kind of the two big ones. There's some others out there like Nime. For the longest time in my career, I used SSIS and various schedulers like TWS, which basically just ran batch files on a schedule, or a SQL Server agent and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways, different forms that data prep can take, a lot of different paths, but a lot of the principles are the same. Largely what I'm talking about today will be platform agnostic. So I'm sure all of you use different things. So hopefully it is helpful regardless of what you're using. And I'll talk about some specifics that, that are tool specific as well. And of course, at the end, I'll take all the questions that I can, and we'll go through any specifics beyond that. But I'm going to take you through a little bit of a journey here. So here are the things that I'm going to talk about. So what's optimization? Why is it important? Why does it keep getting pushed into your backlog? And why should you not do that? How do you plan for success when it comes to optimization for data prep? And what principles and strategies can you use to achieve that? And ultimately, at the end of the day, why this is all about trust and how it can help you build trust within your organization. So starting out, let's talk about the risks of not doing it right. And so we'll talk through a cautionary tale. Imagine that you are in an organization that's spinning up operational reporting or whatever other kind of reporting, whether it's financial, for a new area of business, and you just got a new set of data starting to trickle in. And let's say the data is available on your server, and let's say you've got a data mart and it's ready to go at 6 a.m. and you're dependent on files that come in at certain times of the day. So you can't really start it much earlier than that. So really we've got, I'm simplifying this quite a bit from how it typically looks, but just for the illustration of the example. So let's say your jobs can start at 6 a.m. and your goal is to get a report out by 8 a.m. You've got this executive report that goes out, and your leadership, they want to have that report ready to go on their desk. They actually like it printed out. So you build it so it can be printed out on their desk, ready to go for them at the beginning of the day at 8 a.m. so that they can look at it, make their decisions based on that data, because that's the point of all this, right? So you've got two jobs, job A and job B. Job B is dependent on job A finishing and completing and being accurate before job B can run, because otherwise, job B is not going to produce the right results. So this is week one of this new reporting process. So as we progress, week two, there's a little bit more data in the tables now. It takes a little bit longer to run, but it's not too bad. So we go to week three, and still looking good. Okay, so no one's really looking at this at any point. Like they built the jobs, they're running fast, like there's no problems, and so no one's paying attention. So we go to week four and week five, still no problems. No one's really looking at this, it's just running. Week six, no problems. Week seven, things are going great. Week 8 and 9 and 10. And then all of a sudden at week 11, we have our first hiccup. Oops, job A wasn't finished. So we have to we got to move job B just a little bit later, no big deal. So we'll just bump that later by 15 minutes and no problem, right? So we do that, so still no problems. Week 13, week 14, week 15, oh, there's a slight overlap again. Okay, we've got to move job B to 7 a.m. Oh, but when we do that, week 16, the executive report isn't ready on time. It finishes too late. So we're running out of time. We just don't have enough hours in the morning between 6 and 8 a.m. to do this. So I guess we have to just say, well, the report's going to be ready a little bit later than 8 a.m. We'll say it's going to be ready at 10 a.m. That should give us plenty of time, right? So we do that. Week 17, 18, oh, they overlapped again, but no one noticed. So the report showed the prior day instead of the current day for most of the week until we caught it. And then we fixed it. No one said anything, so we're probably okay, right? week 19, 20. You can see where this is going real quick, I bet. And you probably have some thoughts on this, which, yeah. So, well, week 22, 23, 24, oh no, we've got a job overlap again. Okay, let's just move job B. Everyone's working on really important stuff, by the way. So they don't have time to make these jobs run shorter or find creative solutions to address these recurring issues, because we're building new stuff and we have to have something to demo, and this doesn't demo. So let's move job B back, and then we missed the 10 a.m. deadline, so we've got to move the deadline back. Let's shift the goal a little bit. It was 8 a.m. now it's 10 a.m. Let's move it back to noon. So now we got plenty of time. That's plenty of wiggle room. So we hit another overlap. We got to move job B back. You might sense a pattern recurring here. Another overlap. We got to move the job, and it's taking longer and longer until we get to a point where now we can't even hit the noon deadline. Our jobs are overlapping regardless, and we don't even have enough hours in the morning to complete the job. It's taking over 6 hours at this point to produce this executive report, just because we're getting more data in. It's not scaling well, and didn't plan for this, because it was working fine for so long, and then all of a sudden these issues come up and it becomes a fire, and you have to stop everything and deal with this until you can continue. So what went wrong? A lot of things, right? So surely this couldn't happen to us in our organization, except like, I don't know about you, where you're at, but I have seen this just about every organization, that I've worked for directly. I've seen it happen over and over. And while the example that I showed is maybe a little bit perhaps exaggerated, maybe not so exaggerated. So what leads to this sort of thing? When we're seeing it in this terms, it looks so ridiculous. You're like, why would you let this continue without addressing it? Because you're going to have problems continuing. Well, the way it happens is by people not looking at what we were just looking at. So there's a lack of visibility, a lack of planning that comes with that visibility. So if you don't have data, you can't see the data, you can't act on the data and plan according to it. And everyone's always busy. There's always really important stuff that's happening. Like everyone's plate is full, right? You're doing other important things. And optimization, it takes backseat to all of the other things that are perceived to be more important until you just can't ignore it anymore. So it's this kind of odd space where optimization is not at all glamorous, because sure, you can do math around like, here's the work I'm spending on making these workflows run faster so that we don't run into problems. But it's, again, not something that you can really show on a demo call and say, hey, we got this new dashboard, we got this new data product that we're delivering. Isn't it great? Doesn't it answer all your questions? This is a little more behind the scenes. So it's harder to sell from that perspective. So why do we optimize, or why do we prioritize optimization? Why should we? It often seems like it's a low priority until it becomes an absolute emergency, and you can't ignore it anymore. So it just lives in the backlog until it's on fire. So by prioritizing it, we can prevent bigger problems later on. By doing that on an earlier basis and then on a regular basis as we're developing, then that opens up resources. It leaves us more flexible for the rest of the work in the backlog, and it prevents this from ultimately impacting your deliverables. So it helps your team keep a steadier velocity for delivery and just be healthier in general. It reduces your KTLO, or you're keeping the lights on time, where you're just kind of keeping things afloat. And you can actually, by prioritizing it earlier, you can spend more time on other development tasks that have maybe a little bit more spotlight on them. And so that's where it comes into play, is is there an incentive to create quick workflows or to create workflows quickly? at the expense of all of that. It might take a few more points in your, like if you're on an agile cycle, to create a prep workflow that really runs efficiently. So you should think about whether optimization in your case should be based on like story point sizing, if you want to size it in to the story, or if you want to have separate stories, just like, okay, build a workflow and then size another story out for optimizing that same workflow. But either way, you have to do the work. Whether it's later, whether it's sooner, it's usually better to do it sooner. And ultimately doing that, it creates team health. It feels better to have an environment where things aren't blowing up every other week, as we saw in our far-fetched example, right? And ultimately it builds trust with the organization. So I worked in workforce planning space for many years, and this was kind of our mantra of proper planning prevents poor performance. You can find ways to throw a few more P's in there, but it's very true. In order to find success in this area, you have to plan for it, and you have to define it. So what does success look like? Well, we want to evaluate risk before it arrives, not after, not in an emergency, but we want to anticipate it. And that will help us to minimize disruption to our schedules, the jobs that we're running, the workflows, and the resulting quality problems. Data quality is just it's a huge thing that is just a recurring thing that you can't, it doesn't happen by accident. You have to actively pay attention to it in order to ensure that it doesn't become a problem, which in turn affects trust within your organization. Are you able to deliver what you said you're going to deliver on time? So how do you do this? How do you plan for success in this area? Well, we need some data. So we need some log tables, right? And here's my visual dad joke of just, we need those kind of log tables. No, maybe not. Ultimately, we need data. We need visibility into our integration process and your data prep jobs. You need to be able to see the kind of thing that we were looking at that team clearly wasn't. So you've got to measure when your jobs are running and how long they run. That's the bare minimum. Depending on your platform, it may be doing that for you automatically. So if you've got Alteryx Gallery up and running, if you're using Tableau Prep Conductor, or if you're just running stuff from batch files, there's ways to get at that data of when did our jobs run, how long did it take? That's the bare minimum entry point. And as we'll talk about, there's a lot more that you can add to that logging to add value. So so you've got built-in stuff. You can also, I recommend adding a layer on top of that for custom logging so that you can record more data that your platform might not automatically be recording for you, such as, number of records that were operated on that we pulled or pushed, maybe summarized metric values for each job of like, here's how many dollars it found in this file across this column, or here's a value, or here, some other measure within the data that would give you an idea of whether there's a data quality problem or not. So by capturing this, it gives you an earlier warning on if there's action that is needed in order to correct a problem. So get some logging going. And of course, you can use that data. You got to create some reports. This is what we're doing. So we're creating prep jobs around that logging data so that we can both create the data and consume it, and create an analytics process around understanding if there's risk based on what we're seeing, or if there's action that's required. So things that you want to look at based on that data, we want to look at data growth. So how much data are you consuming? How much data are you pushing out? And what is the rate of growth over time? So you might have a brand new process. You might have a stable process that's been going for a while, where it's very predictable, but you don't know until you check. You want to know if you're sized correctly based on the tools that you're using, and if there's risk inherent in the rate of growth. Also, like it's not always a just linear scale between the number of rows you're operating on and the job time. So your row count might be going up in a linear sense, but your runtime might go up at a greater pace than that, just because of the amount of records, the amount of data that needs to be kept in memory for those jobs. So that creates bigger problems than you might even anticipate just looking at something like row count. But basic modeling, look at the historical data. We're all smart people here. We can take a look at the data and determine if we're going to run into trouble. And what kind of questions you want to ask. So how much data are you expecting to support, and can you support it ultimately? And what are your deliverables? So if you've got executive reports, if you've got base operational reports, you need to know what your customers need from you. So how are they using the data? When are they accessing the reports? What kind of decisions are they making with those reports? And do they have what they need when they need it, ultimately, is what it comes down to. If you can deliver that, then you build trust with the organization. If you can't, then you diminish it. Trust is something you always want to accumulate and not spend. So and data quality builds into that. So here's what we're going to talk about next is like, what do you do? So three main things. So how do we reduce the data prep workflow runtime? And I'll give a few examples of what that looks like in certain platforms. What can you do to reduce your development time in general? Just be smart about how you're developing those workflows. And how do you avoid tech debt? Which is an important concept to understand, especially in this space. For quicker runtimes, the big one, this is probably one of the biggest ones that is perhaps low-hanging fruit, but filter early and filter often. Do you really need every single field from your data source that you're pulling from that file, from that SQL table? Are you really operating on all rows within that data set, or you just need some of them? This is a simple step, and it's easy to forget as you're just going in, building a workflow, building a process. The earlier in the process that you can get away with filtering rows or eliminating fields, the more efficient the entire process will be. Sometimes you need everything, and there's no way around that. But I've run across few situations where I need literally every field. A lot of times that's the quickest space to slim down, is by just not pulling in certain fields. And depending on the tool, you can add filters on the import step, and it will actually rewrite the SQL for you if you're pulling from a database, so that it's not pulling in the data into memory and then filtering it out, but it'll actually only pull in what it needs, which is really what you want. So that's the biggest one. That's probably the lowest hanging fruit. So next one is select appropriate data types. If you're not familiar with data types, look up the documentation for data types for your platform. There's for example, for Alteryx, there's a wealth of documentation for what's available. There's like 4 different types of string fields. You've got different sizes of integer. Like not everything needs to be a float. A lot of times a small integer or a byte field or something like that will do. It won't truncate anything. You'll have the same quality of data, but it's going to be a lot smaller, a lot less data to move around in memory or back and forth between systems. So understand your data types. It's a little bit more complicated in Alteryx because you have more flexibility on how you select data types. There's just more options available. In something like Tableau Prep, it's a little bit more simple, like a string is a string in Tableau Prep. Date or date times a date time. So there's not a lot of variation that you would see like with selecting data types at like the database level or something like that. So Alteryx is closer to that. It also has some tools for like autofield, where it will look at strings and decide what's the right length for that, and it'll help you out with that process. Though sometimes that's helpful to just actually know what to set it, and then take the auto field back out and then just manually set those types with a select tool instead, because the auto tool, that takes time to run too. So you can just use it as a guide to make decisions. Another big one, incremental refreshes. So if you, what this looks like is push only new recent records to perhaps a staging table. And then you can use, so if you're using like a SQL database environment, in Alteryx, for example, you can push out to a separate table that's just for dumping the recent records from your job, and then you can use a separate stored procedure using PostSQL to process those records and compare them against the production table and say, okay, let's take out the matching rows and then put in the new stuff, and then clear out the staging table or just drop it when you're done. So that way you're not having to blast and reload the entire table. It's easier usually, especially when things are new and there's not much data, to just delete everything, put in all the new records. But over time, it's not going to be sustainable, and you end up with problems like what we saw earlier. So PostSQL is really powerful for that. In Tableau Prep, it's actually pretty simple to do this. It's kind of just an option that you can select. So you can set the workflow to an incremental refresh mode by specifying an input field that's used for comparison. So it will check to see what's already in the data. It'll check to see what's in the data you're pulling in. If you give it, say, a list of reporting dates, then it'll just look for the changes and just pull in the rows that are changed, and then you can append those at the end. Like Power BI has options for this too. So if you're using Power Query, Power BI, there are ways that you can filter the input data, and you can set an incremental refresh policy that will take effect once the model is published to search. So there's options for this pretty much regardless of what you use. And if it's not out of the box, then it's often worth taking the time to figure out how to engineer that and create it so that you have something that can be adjusted. So the next tip that I have is the fastest workflow is the one that doesn't run, because it doesn't have to run. So if you run into situations where something needs to refresh frequently, let's say you've got intraday reports where they're operational reports that are used multiple times throughout the day, and maybe they're refreshed on an hourly basis. But if there's no new data, then maybe you don't need to run it. So that's just about adding a layer of logic in front of the actual workflow. You can do that through chaining workflows, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can add logic to just check to see if the workflow needs to be run at all. And if it's running and chugging through those rows every time and there's actually no changes, then why run it? So you can save server resources that way. So yeah, just something to consider there. Another big one. So consider how much work is being done by the database, if you're pulling from a relational database like SQL or Oracle or something like that, and how much work is being done by the prep tool. In some situations, and you have to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis, right? What's going to work best for you? Both in terms of like handoff elements of low code versus high code. Also, like, what's your comfort level with SQL, with just maybe just to back up for a second. So what this means is if you're pulling in rows from multiple tables, joining together, you're aggregating, you're filtering, and maybe they're from very, very big tables. Like, do you need to pull in all of that data from the database to the either your local machine where the prep job is running while you're developing it, or if you're pushing it out to the server, like a gallery or prep conductor or something like that? Is it best to pull in all of those rows into local memory and then have all of those operations done in the tool? Or can you just write a quick, select from group by where statement in SQL where it can leverage the indexes and ultimately only send you a small subset of the rows that are already filtered, already aggregated, and then you can run a much quicker job that adds more value with that prep tool, doing things that prep tool does really well, like fixing data quality problems, or like unpivoting things, which are really hard to do in SQL. So, analytics, geospatial stuff that you can't really do in those environments. Let the prep tool do what the prep tool is really good at. Like for Alteryx, for example, you've got InDB tools. You also have to be careful about what you do in DB, because you can't do everything. You're limited basically just in the same ways. And you don't have like pre-SQL and stuff like that you can do for InDB tools. But that often is really helpful, because basically you give it the logic and it will write the SQL for you. So if you're not sure, check with your DBA or check with people in your organization who are closer to the data, who might be able to provide some recommendations there. But it doesn't hurt to learn a little SQL. It can be really beneficial for understanding, how to alleviate some of these bottlenecks. And so this one, so conditionally chaining jobs and workflows together. Depending on your platform, your solutions here may look different, but there are ways to set up logic to run a set of workflows in series so that each one begins right after the last one completes. In our cautionary tale earlier, you saw jobs bumping into each other, and it took manual effort to shift those around so that they didn't. This is kind of an end run around all of that by just conditionally chaining them. So job A stops, that means job B will start right after. You would think that this, should be like an out of the box thing. It should be really easy to set this up. For something like SSIS jobs that I worked on for a long time, that's just kind of how they worked, right? Especially within the job, one thing is dependent on another thing completing in order to run the next step, whatever that is. But you might have to go through a few more layers, and you'll have to decide if it's worth it for you, because this might require some kind of special customization. But so in Alteryx, you've got some options. If you're running designer only, there's macros. There's a nice macro that you can run, like from Marquee Group, that is popular for chaining workflows together. So there's options in the macro space. If you're using Designer with Scheduler or with Gallery, you can actually set a command line action to run the next specified workflow when the current one completes. Through there's the events tab in the window, workflow configuration window lets you do that. And this will either execute the next specified workflow when the current one completes, if you put in the command accordingly, or there's also a command that you can enter to queue up the next workflow when the current job is completed. So it just depends on how you configure it, but you've got options. It's a little bit more involved because you have to know where those files are stored. You have to know where the executable is on the server. So you might have to work with your server admin. Well, you certainly would want to work with your server admin if you're doing something like that. But it is an option, and that can open up some space for you if you need to make sure that a workflow is done at the earliest possible time and you have several dependencies before that. So another way you can do it in Alteryx is by setting the workflows up as analytical apps, which gives you a little bit more explicit control for chaining analytical apps together using the design interface, because you can actually just say, run this analytical app after this one is complete, and you can chain them together in a more intuitive way. So Tableau Prep options are a little bit more limited for that. Conductor doesn't support chaining jobs. You schedule them basically like you'd schedule, let's say, an extract refresh on Tableau server for workbook, same sort of deal, but you have to give it a certain time. So the way around it there is to basically just not use Conductor, and there's macros that you can set up. I should say batch files. So you could, there are command prompts that you can run to initiate that batch file, and you can schedule them, and you can add logic into the batch files that way. So again, a little bit more custom. If you choose that path, then you're not using Prep Conductor anymore, and you also lose the benefits of seeing the reporting and the logging that it just has built in. So you have to consider, what am I losing versus gaining? It's a little tougher to set it up in those environments. So tips to speed up preparation development. Some things to think about. These aren't going to be the right solution in all cases, but they often can be. So one thing is, if you've got a really big job, it takes a long time to run, consider splitting it into multiple smaller jobs. If one of the 20 jobs fail, it's 25 times faster to just run the one failed job than to run the big one that contains everything. Easier from a kind of maintenance standpoint that way. This could look like separate individual workflows that point to a variety of smaller files. So let's say if you've got 20 files that come in on a daily basis, and you need to process all 20 of those. You could have a single workflow that just loops through all of those. That's usually the way that I would approach it, right? But if they're bigger and there's more risk of failure, if one doesn't come in at the right time or there's some other problem that comes up, you might want to consider having a way to segment those out. So you can just rerun part of that, because that will save you time in terms of having to rerun jobs that fail. You could use something like the Alteryx tile tool if you're using Alteryx, and punch it through an iterative macro that will loop through sections of your data set at a time, and even flag any that throw errors, and you could tie that into your logging. It will also allow you to find and address errors that much more quickly, since you have a narrow area of focus and more data about where it happened and potentially why it happened through the logs that you're generating that way. So just something to consider. It's not always the best approach. Sometimes you really want to do as much as you can with a single job. And the beauty is you've got options there. So you can try what works for you. There's no one size fits all solution here, but know that you have options, and this could be one of them. This one is just a really good general best practice when you're developing workflows, but just work against a subset of the data. If you've got a table with 40 million records, probably don't need to pull all 40 million records in when you are working with things. You probably just need a subset of that. So you can use the approach that we talked about earlier to just filter the data as early as possible, either through just filter tools, or just write a quick SQL query with a where statement at the end of it, or just pull in top 10,000 rows, or whatever the case might be. You might not get all of your dimensions accounted for in that, but you can at least start to pull things in. And you can get creative about how you do that too. But obviously it's a lot faster to work against a smaller data set when you're developing. And then when it's all ready to go, you can test it, evaluate, iterate if you need to, all that good stuff. And another thing, so with Alteryx specifically, you can freeze the data so that you can freeze the workflow up to a certain section, so that it's just ready to go in memory, and it won't try to rerun that every time you test out the workflow and click on run. So that allows you to work more quickly. Definitely recommend that where it's applicable. There's also options for using pre-SQL to fire off things like stored procedures, to just prep data, or add in custom logic to determine, should I run this process to refresh this table, or should I just leave the data as it is because it's been recently refreshed? And you can kind of chain workflows that way, if you consider stored procedures on the server side to be workflows as well, since that's part of, that could be part of the chain of your data prep process. So there's creative ways that you can use these tools to work things together. Another thing is avoid duplicating business logic where you can. This can sometimes run contrary to the very first bullet point, where if you've got business logic and it's split up in 20 jobs, the other side of the coin here is that if that changes, you've got 20 jobs to update. On the other hand, if you can either build that logic upstream of the 20 processes that you've split out, so that it happens before all of the rest of them do, or build it in a centralized way, so you just have one place where it's updated, then that it's just that much less that you have to maintain over time if something changes, or when something changes, because change is inevitable, right? So next I'll go into tech debt. So if you don't know what tech debt is, we want to avoid building something that's just going to break if we don't do anything over time. So basically it's a quick fix for something that works, but it won't work forever. So what does that mean? Things like dimensionality. You want to keep dimensionality in your data, particularly on dates. You want it to be vertical rather than horizontal. So you don't want to add fields for new date periods to things. So you don't want sales 2019, sales 2020, sales 2021 as different fields within your table, because every year that means you're going to have to make an update to the logic in order to keep things running as expected for the user. And that's, that one's kind of common sense, but there are other ways that can manifest where, there's other dimensionality within the data, perhaps, that, it's not as apparent as dates, but maybe you have different sections of the business and you've got different tables for each one. And so when there's a reorg and now your 3 become 5, or your 5 become 3, then you suddenly have to change your data structure, and your existing prep workflow won't accommodate that. So whatever your dimension looks like, whether that's dates, whether that's business organization names, things like that, try to keep that normalized so that the data can just flow in as expected, and it doesn't require like a schema change in order to accommodate it. So it's, a lot of this might seem like common sense, but I see it. It happens a lot. Along those lines, avoid partitioning the same data across different tables with the same schema. There are some exceptions to this. Like you might, if you've got a really big table, and this kind of gets into DBA territory, but if you've got a really big table, you might consider having like a separate archive table if it's just like, we need to keep this, but we generally don't need to touch it. It's not used operationally, but we don't want to get rid of it. That leaves less rows to operate on a regular basis when we have to pull from or update. But what I mean by this is, when avoiding partitioning data across tables, maybe don't have 5 tables, one for each operational area, or like a sales 2020 table, sales 2021 table. Things that are going to change over time. So you want to anticipate changes to the business, changes to the reporting, and normalize for those, and not iterate in a schema sense over those, if that makes sense. And just in a general sense, look beyond what the MVP is. Like in our cautionary tale, they put something together that worked, but clearly it didn't work forever. That's what we want to avoid here. So if you can see a problem ahead, if you can be forward thinking and anticipate that and show, hey, I accounted for this, here's a problem that we won't have because of the design, then that's a win. That's a good story. Heck, that's something you could even demo, is to saying, hey, we're thinking ahead here, and we want everyone to be successful. And so here are the things that we have done to make sure that everyone can be successful in the future. So your MVP isn't always V in the long run if you don't think about that. And we're getting to the end here. So just a few closing thoughts of, a lot of this I've talked about before, but like data quality, it doesn't happen by accident. It's a continual effort, requires attention, it requires active monitoring. When there are problems that happen with data quality, do you want your customers to alert you of defects, to say, hey, I opened this report and it doesn't look right? I've had that happen to me plenty of times. Or would you rather be able to proactively communicate with them and say, hey, I caught this. There may be an error in today's report. You caught it. Your customer doesn't have to catch it. Or you can even correct the problem if possible before there's an impact. And then, that's the ideal. So you need to, you want to anticipate. So you have to plan and build a data quality alert system if you want to achieve that, which basically the reason I mentioned this in the scope of optimization is that this fits in real nicely with those log tables that we're talking about. So if we're measuring when a job starts and ends and how long it took, you might as well measure attributes of those tables that tell you if the data is probably correct or probably incorrect. And you can look at things like row count. So if I'm only seeing 1/10 of the row count being imported that I usually do on a daily basis, that might be a flag to say there could be something wrong here. So that gives you an early heads up on potential data quality issues. So you can create rules around what variance in those values are expected, and what values outside that range should trigger a notification for you or someone on your team to investigate. And if you can plan and build a system like this, act on it when you receive an alert from any of your workflows, communicate to your customer about what's being done to correct the problem, you build trust. On the other hand, if you leave it to your customer to find problems in the report, which they now have to take time out of their day to tell you about, and then wait for it to be corrected, they'll lose confidence in those dashboards and potentially in your team real quick. So it's about trust. Often optimization work gets backlogged, it's pushed back till it's on fire. You have to drop everything and deal with it. It's not a good look. It's not a good feel. That's hopefully this is helpful. hopefully I got my point across effectively, and gave you some ideas on ways that you can just make your data prep development process a little bit quicker, a little bit more consistent, avoid these sorts of problems, and specific ideas of what that might look like within your platform that you're using, knowing that there are a lot of them out there. So that's the end of my structured content, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have, best I can at least. So Katie, any questions that you're seeing?
I do see one that I'll answer real quick. With this recording, notes and slides from the deck be sent to us after the event? I can send the recording. We'll go to everyone that registered. James, did you want to send any notes, or do you have any resources for anyone that you would like to be part of that email as well?
Let's see. So I could send the deck out, though I'm actually planning a more comprehensive kind of write-up of this. That might be a slightly better format. So if you're looking for something that you can share with your organization and say, like, hey, I've been saying this, you should listen to me. We should do this kind of work. Like this matters because we're going to run into these problems. I'm working on a blog post that will cover a lot of this and will be a little bit more shareable as just a link that you can send. So look for that, I would say.
Great. I'm not seeing any more questions coming through the Q&A. Otherwise, I dropped me and James' LinkedIn in the chat box. So if you have any questions after the webinar or after you get the recording, you can reach out to either one of us there. But James, if you're good to wrap up, I can wrap us up real quick before we all head on with our day.
Let's see. Oh, yeah, I think there is one question I think that popped in.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I see it, so I can read that. Can you go into more detail about balancing work from the database and prep tools and how SQL can be used? Yeah, so just to kind of back into that discussion of work that the database is doing versus work that your prep tool is doing. Like, there is ultimately work to be done one place or the other, and often both. So if you're pulling from a flat file, that's not a database, it's just reading the contents of that file. But data has to stream from wherever that file is stored, whether it's on a network drive or a web location that you're pulling from, to local memory, one way or another. So if you're pulling from a database, however, then you've got a relational system where you've got different tables. Those tables are indexed so that you can find rows within that table quickly, and it's designed in such a way where you can query the results in a filtered, aggregated way more efficiently than pulling each of those tables in their entirety and then doing that work in memory. You're using the database and leveraging it for things that it is good at doing, rather than pulling all of the raw data into memory in Alteryx or Tableau Prep, and then having it crunch through all of that to produce effectively what would be the same result. So it's thinking about, like, how much work can I have the server do here before I need to pull it into the prep tool. Often, if you can write some SQL, that will minimize the amount of data it needs to pull in, and then have the prep tool do what the prep tool is really good at and what the database can't. Then you're in better shape. Like, database can do joins and regular simple aggregates, or even complex aggregates for that matter, but it can do those things really well. What it can't do well is things that are unique to prep tools, like machine learning models, geospatial analysis, unpivoting. That's a big one that I end up using quite a bit, that you just can't easily do that in a database. Even odd things like median calculation. At least last time I had to do that on SQL Server, there isn't a median function. I had to write some crazy custom code in order to accomplish that. Whereas in Tableau prep or Alteryx, you just select median from the list and then you're good to go. So hopefully that answers your question.
Looks like you have another one in the chat too, James.
Oh, yes, I see it. So the question is, I think the biggest thing is how to convince senior level management to prioritize optimization projects instead of some of the other projects at hand. How do we convince them before there's actually a fire? That's the $1 million question. Trying to, I don't know if evangelize is the appropriate, but just show the value. I mean, really, so what they're going to be caring about is what's risk look like and what value are we providing for however we're spending our time. And the more you can do to quantify that, to put in concrete terms what the impact of making this decision versus that decision is going to be, I think the more successful that conversation will go. So if you just go in with just like, I'm seeing these problems, like I have a feeling this is going to end badly, you might be absolutely correct. But if you come in with data, if you come in with something to show, okay, here's our growth rate, we're not sized properly, we're going to run into problems where we can't produce these reports on a regular basis and meet the needs of the business unless we take action. And we want to avoid disruption to the business because of that. Here's how much effort we estimate this is going to take. That might cut into our other production work, but here's why it's worth it. And here's why it's necessary. Be prepared, I guess, and come with data, come with something concrete that you can share. So that's my best advice for that. Great question. Anything else?
Not seeing any more in the chat. We can give it a minute or two before we wrap up.
Yeah, I really appreciate everyone joining. And yeah, I hope this was helpful. I hope it was valuable. Again, watch the Tessellation blog, or you can follow me on like LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, and I'll push it out there. But I'm working on a blog post covering similar content that, again, is easier to share than, listening to an hour webinar. So yeah, I just appreciate everyone coming to join.
All right, thanks, James, for a fantastic presentation, and for all of you for attending today. Please do not hesitate to reach out to James or I on LinkedIn. I dropped our contact information in the chat for everyone, and I'll share these links on our event page on LinkedIn as well. If you'd like to refer back to the webinar at a later time, the webinar recording will be emailed to everyone by the end of day tomorrow. And that is all for today. Thanks again to everyone who attended this webinar. We hope to see you at our upcoming events. Bye, have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.